Welcome, friend. Tonight, we're going to step softly into the dimly lit past, into a world where silence often echoed louder than sound, and the rhythm of life felt slower, more uncertain, and deeply fragile. If you've ever wondered what it was truly like to survive one of the most difficult periods in medieval history, this journey is for you. As always, if you enjoy these calming historical explorations, consider subscribing to this channel and giving the video a gentle thumbs up. It really helps us continue sharing these thoughtful stories from the past. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, or when you like to listen. Morning coffee? Bedtime wind down? Now dim the lights. Settle into your favorite blanket or pillow. Let the noise of the modern world drift away. Tonight, we're slipping back into the shoes of someone who survived the unimaginable, a quiet survivor of a plague that swept through the land, forever changing how people lived, worked, and connected. Let's begin. In the quiet aftermath, the world felt hollow. The village, once alive with the clatter of carts and the sound of voices rising in song or argument, now echoed with absence. It was not a silence born of peace, but one that hung heavily in the air, like fog that refused to lift. For those who had managed to endure the weeks of dread and uncertainty, life afterward was not a celebration. It was a slow, cautious return to something that barely resembled what had been before. A man named Toland stood at the edge of a worn footpath, staring out at the fields that once yielded barley and flax. He was a simple man, a leatherworker by trade, whose life had been shaped by the steady rhythm of seasons, market days, and the clang of his tools. But now, his calloused hands felt strangely idle, as though the tools he had once wielded no longer belonged to him. His leather bench sat unused, dust-covered, and lonely in the corner of his modest cottage. Toland had not asked to survive. It wasn't a matter of strength, nor of virtue, nor even faith. It was, in his view, a strange twist of fate, one that left him with more questions than answers. Around him, the world looked the same, the thatched rooftops, the winding road to the well, the sheep that wandered just beyond the fence line. And yet, everything felt different, as if the land itself was unsure of what came next. Food was scarce. The market that had once drawn villagers together each week now stood eerily empty. Stalls had been abandoned, baskets overturned, fabrics left out to bleach in the sun, forgotten by hands that never returned to claim them. Those who remained were wary of gathering. They kept distance without speaking of it, shuffling past one another with downcast eyes, wrapped in cloaks that hid their faces more from fear than from weather. The priest, once a steady figure in the village, had taken to standing outside the chapel rather than inviting people in. He offered soft words of comfort, but no answers. His sermons had become brief and reflective, focused more on healing than judgment. Toland remembered watching him light a single candle each morning and set it in the windowsill, just one flickering flame in a village that once knew dozens. It was a gesture not of faith, but of memory. Children no longer played in the common square. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by cautious whispers and a strange maturity that came far too early. The youth who had once chased geese or tossed pebbles into the stream now sat quietly beside their elders, doing chores with small, solemn hands. Toland often wondered if they would ever learn to play again, or if they would grow into adults who only remembered fear. For Toland, each morning began with routine, not out of necessity, but out of survival. He fetched water, though it was more than he needed. He mended the fence, though no livestock had wandered near it in weeks. He boiled oats and ate them alone. These small tasks tethered him to the world, even as he questioned whether the world still had a place for him. One morning, he walked the long path to the village perimeter. There, nestled between two ancient elms, stood the remnants of a cart. Its wheel had broken, and it leaned awkwardly, half covered by vines. Toland remembered the family who once owned it, a large, boisterous bunch with too many children and not enough shoes. They had passed through every week, singing songs and trading tinware. Now the cart remained, but its owners were nowhere to be found. He ran a hand across the wood, rough and splintered. It was as though time had stopped mid-motion, leaving the village frozen in a state of unfinished departure. So many lives had moved on without truly moving at all. In the evenings, he sat by the hearth, letting the warmth settle into his bones. He no longer lit a large fire, just a small one, enough to warm a corner of the room. The rest of the cottage stayed cool, untouched. He found comfort in shadows. They reminded him of the people he had lost, and, in a strange way, made him feel less alone. There were moments when Tolan imagined leaving, walking away from the village entirely, finding a new place where the past did not linger in every doorway. But each time he gathered his belongings, something stopped him. A familiar tree, a stone path, the quiet knock of wind against his shutter. It was as if the village, however altered, still needed its few remaining souls to stay rooted. He wasn't alone in this lingering. Others had survived, too. Mira, the baker's daughter, now managed the oven herself. She had learned to knead dough not from instruction, but from watching her father for years. Her loaves were uneven, sometimes undercooked, sometimes overbaked. But they were warm. And they smelled of memory. Tolan bought one each week, not for hunger, but for connection. Once, while collecting firewood in the edge of the forest, Tolan met an old shepherd named Darren. The man walked with a slight limp, his gray cloak patched with wool scraps. He spoke slowly and said little, but he always offered a nod of recognition. They didn't speak of what had happened. There was no need. It sat between them like a quiet, shared burden. In time, a new sort of routine emerged in the village. It was slower, quieter, gentler. People bartered instead of traded. They shared rather than sold. There were no festivals, but there were moments. A warm stew left at a doorstep, a song hummed from an open window, a child's chalk drawing on a stone wall. These were the fragments of recovery. Not a return to what was, but a cautious step toward what might someday be. The village had not been lost entirely. It had changed, yes, but it had not disappeared. It breathed, even if faintly. And in that breath, there was hope. Tolan understood that survival came with its own form of sorrow. It meant remembering those who were no longer there. It meant waking up when others did not. But it also meant bearing witness to the world that remained, to the small beauty of a sunrise over the fields, or the distant sound of Myra's baking bell, or the first laugh of a child after weeks of silence. He did not feel brave. He did not feel chosen. But he felt something stirring, slowly, gently, like the first bloom after a long winter. And that, he decided, was reason enough to stay. Tolan awoke earlier now than he had before. It wasn't because he had somewhere to be, few people did anymore, but because his body had learned the rhythm of quiet dawns. The kind where the sun didn't rise in a blaze of glory, but crept slowly up behind a shroud of low clouds, painting the world in soft grays and cool silvers. There was comfort in those colors. They were neither harsh nor demanding. They asked nothing of him but awareness, and maybe a whisper of appreciation. He rolled off his cot, still creaking in the same familiar way it always had, and wrapped himself in the coarse wool blanket that had belonged to his father. The cottage was silent, but not empty. It held the weight of memories, the hum of routine, the presence of time. There was something deeply human about tending to the same old things, even when the world outside had changed so drastically. He pulled water from the clay jug by the door, splashed it over his face, and winced at its cold bite. He dried his cheeks on a rough cloth and looked out the window at the yard, where weeds now grew with surprising enthusiasm. He hadn't had the heart to pull them, not because he liked the way they looked, but because they were living, and anything green and persistent felt like a tiny form of hope. It had been months since the worst of it. Though time felt shapeless, villagers had begun measuring it in small milestones. Since the last time the sky went red, some would say, referring to a particularly strange sunset. Others marked it by the return of birds, or by Myra's first successful loaf of bread that didn't taste like ash. Tolan marked it differently. For him, the turning point was the day he spoke with another person not out of need, but out of desire. That day, he had visited old Darren again, offering him a patch of boiled wool for mending. The conversation had been brief and awkward, but it had stirred something. It reminded him that people were still people, even when they were quiet, even when they had lost so much. There was no plan to rebuild the village in any formal sense. No one had arrived with scrolls or hammers declaring a new era. Instead, recovery came in quiet, disjointed gestures. It came when one person helped another patch a roof. When someone left vegetables outside a neighbor's door. When the blacksmith returned, not to forge weapons, but to mend horseshoes and hang kettles again. It came with the sounds of chickens returning to coops and the discovery that laughter, though rare, still existed. Toland began clearing out his small workshop in the back of the cottage. At first, it was simply to make room, to dust off the bench and stack the unused leather scraps. But as his hands brushed over the tools, worn but familiar, something within him stirred. He hadn't crafted anything since the world had changed. His fingers ached with rust. His eyes searched the grooves in the wood as if they might contain instructions. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to mend an old satchel that had belonged to his brother. The leather was cracked. The stitches had come undone. It wasn't salvageable for use, but that didn't matter. Toland wasn't trying to make something new. He was trying to remember how. His days fell into a quiet rhythm again, though far different than before. The village felt like a place half-sketched. Structure stood, but life moved like a slow tide. Some homes remained sealed shut. Others bore marks on the doors, old warnings that no one had yet removed. But even among the stillness, new signs of living began to emerge. Mira had started leaving her bakery door open in the afternoons, letting the smell of warm bread drift down the road. Occasionally, Toland would see a pair of children sitting outside, breaking rolls with solemn little fingers. He saw Thomas, the carpenter's son, one morning dragging a pile of branches to the center of the village green. Toland didn't ask what he was doing, but he helped anyway. Together, they arranged the branches in a circle, more symbolic than structural. Later that week, the villagers used it as a gathering place. No speeches were made. No declarations were given. But a few people brought pots of stew, and someone played a flute, off-key but determined. It was the first communal act since the silence began. And in its own quiet way it mattered. Evenings remained somber, but less so than before. Toland would light a single candle, place it near the hearth, and sit with a cup of broth. Sometimes he would read from an old book of stories, not aloud but quietly enough to remember the words. The tales were simple, fables of foxes and stags, of clever farmers and wise old women, but they carried the weight of tradition. Stories had always outlived hardship. They were the threads that wove one generation to the next. Even when the world trembled, stories whispered that it could be stitched back together again. As the months passed, Toland began to notice other changes. The fields, once overgrown and wild, had started to show signs of careful hands. Someone was planting again, not in neat rows, but in clustered pockets. He found a patch of turnips behind his cottage, half-harvested. He never discovered who had planted them, but he tended to the soil anyway, watering it when it hadn't rained and clearing out the dry leaves. There was something humbling about caring for a garden you didn't begin. It felt like a gesture of trust, a quiet promise that someone else still believed in growth. One day, Mira asked him to repair a torn strap on her satchel. She brought it to him with an air of casual necessity, as though the request held no deeper meaning. But Toland understood. It was her way of saying, "I remember who you were before, and I see that person still." He fixed it carefully, sewing the stitch as evenly as he could manage. When he returned it to her, she smiled and handed him a warm scone in return. No words passed between them about the trade, but the exchange lingered with him longer than he expected. There were still shadows, of course. Not all had returned, and not all would. The absence hung in certain spaces, an empty chair at a table, a home that never reopened. But those who remained began to speak of the past in a new way. Not with fear, but with reverence. They remembered the names of those they had known. They spoke of the jokes they used to tell, the things they had planned, the meals they had shared. By speaking their names, they honored their lives, and by continuing their own, they carried the memory forward. The village slowly began to resemble itself again, though in a quieter, more cautious form. Toland noticed that people walked closer now, spoke more softly, and lingered just a little longer at each doorstep. There was a tenderness to the way they interacted, a shared understanding that life was no longer a guarantee, but a gift to be handled with care. Toland's hands grew steadier as he worked. He began making small items again, coin pouches, belts, a pair of gloves for Myra's younger brother. Each piece was simple, but the act of creating brought him peace. He worked not for profit, but for purpose. And that, he discovered, was enough. By the time the leaves turned, casting the village in gold and amber, Toland had begun to feel something he hadn't in a long time: belonging. The world was not what it once was, but it was still a world. A world that needed tending, shaping, healing. And he, along with the others, was learning how to live in it once more. He stood one evening at the edge of the field, watching as a soft mist rolled in, coating the grass in silver dew. The moon hung low, reflecting off the rooftops like a quiet lantern. Toland breathed in the cool air and felt the weight of the past settle, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Something he could stand on. Something solid. For all that had been lost, something remained. Something fragile, yes, but real. And that something was worth waking up for. Toland stood in the doorway of his cottage, one hand resting against the rough grain of the frame. The wood felt different now, not just from years of weathering, but from the way his perception had changed. Before, he had taken it for granted. The creak of the hinges, the way the wind slipped through the gaps in colder months, the worn notch where his father once leaned each morning. But in the months following the Great Silence, everything ordinary had become sacred. Every part of the home he still inhabited reminded him that he was still here, still breathing, still able to feel the cold air against his skin and the solid presence of earth beneath his feet. The cottage, humble and crooked, had stood longer than anyone in the village could remember. It bore scars of long winters and hot summers, of feasts and famines. Toland's grandfather had built the hearth, and his own father had carved the window ledge where a crooked cup still sat. Generations had moved through these rooms. They had whispered secrets into the beams and pressed their feet into the dirt-packed floors. And now, in this quieter era, Toland found himself tracing those stories, not through words, but through textures, through smells, through the careful handling of things long unused. He spent the morning sweeping dust from the corners, brushing cobwebs from shelves, and lifting pots he hadn't touched in half a year. Most of the work was not necessary. He had cleaned these same corners many times, but repetition comforted him. There was something healing in the slow movement of bristles on wood, the clink of clay jars being set back into place, the rhythm of a space being remembered by its caretaker. It felt like stitching torn cloth, one soft, deliberate pass at a time. Outside, the trees whispered in low voices. The wind had shifted with the season, growing colder and more thoughtful. The leaves no longer danced. They drifted. There was a dignity to their fall, as though they too were honoring the passage of time. Toland watched one such leaf land softly on the windowsill and remain there, unmoving. He didn't brush it away. It could stay. The village itself had grown into a strange kind of balance. It was neither thriving nor crumbling, but lingering in the in-between. People spoke more often now, though conversations remained brief. Smiles came quicker, but laughter was still a guest who rarely visited. There were no feasts, but there were shared stews. No dances, but now and then a tune might echo from a cottage, played quietly on a lute or hummed by someone remembering better days. Toland made his way to the old well, a place that had long served as the heart of the village. The stones were mossy and uneven, and the rope had frayed slightly with age, but the bucket still drew water from the cool depths below. As he filled his jug, he noticed someone approaching, a boy no older than 12, with straw-colored hair and a wool cap far too big for his head. The boy paused, offered a shy nod, and waited his turn. Toland stepped aside, letting the boy take the rope. For a moment, they stood in silence. Then the boy spoke. "My sister says you used to make belts." Toland looked down at his hands, then back at the boy. "That's true. A long time ago. She needs one," the boy continued. "Hers broke. She's been tying it with twine." Toland considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Tell her to bring the old one," I'll see what I can do. The boy's eyes brightened, just a little. Thank you. And then he was gone, jogging back up the path with the awkward gait of someone not quite used to their growing limbs. Tolan watched him disappear behind a hedge, then turned back to the well, dipping his fingers in the cold water and feeling something shift inside him. That one brief interaction had more weight than he expected. It wasn't just a request for a belt. It was a request for normalcy, for restoration, for a connection to the world before. That afternoon, Tolan gathered his tools. He laid out a piece of soft leather and began cutting it into strips. His hands remembered the movements before his mind did. The knife moved smoothly, and the leather curled away like ribbon. He hummed softly, not a song, but a pattern of notes he barely recognized, something his mother used to sing while preparing bread. The belt wouldn't take long, but he worked slowly, carefully, savoring the process. As he worked, memories unfolded like parchment. He remembered how busy the village had once been, how the sounds of hammers and saws, barking dogs and laughing children had once filled the air. He remembered helping the carpenter build stalls for the spring fair. He remembered the excitement of market day, the way colors and smells mingled in the air like an invisible festival. And he remembered the quiet days too, the ones spent sitting on his bench, shaping leather while the sun moved lazily across the sky. When the belt was finished, he hung it on a peg near the door, ready for when the girl might arrive. He didn't expect payment. The work itself had already repaid him. That night, he lit a second candle and left it by the window. Not for any particular person, but as a sign, to anyone passing, to himself, to the village at large, that there was still life here. Still warmth. Still someone watching the darkness, and choosing to light something small against it. Over the next few days, Tolan noticed that others were beginning to tend to their homes more deliberately. Mira painted her doorframe a soft blue. Darren stacked his firewood in neat rows, and even Thomas repaired the leaning fence near the common path. These weren't acts of vanity. They were declarations. We are still here, they said. We remember what mattered, and we're choosing to build it again, one slow breath at a time. Then came a letter. Folded neatly and slipped under his door, it was written in careful hand, by the schoolteacher, who had returned quietly a month earlier and taken up residence in her old cottage. She invited Tolan and a few others to a gathering. Nothing formal. Just tea and bread and conversation. He stared at the letter for a long while, unsure how to feel. It had been a long time since someone had invited him anywhere. The idea of sitting in a circle, drinking tea, and speaking aloud felt almost absurd. But he went. There were only 6 of them. They sat on wooden stools in the teacher's sitting room, steam curling from mugs, silence resting softly between them. The teacher, a kind woman named Elin, spoke first, not with instruction, but with vulnerability. She shared how she had spent most of the silent season speaking to an empty room just to remember her own voice. Others shared in turn, not in great stories, but in fragments. A memory of planting onions. The image of a child drawing on a slate. The quiet panic of waking up and not knowing what day it was. Tolan didn't speak much, but he listened. And listening, he realized, was its own kind of speaking. When he did speak, it was only to say how good the tea was. But Elin smiled, and that was enough. The meeting ended with no fanfare, just quiet nods and soft thanks. As he stepped out into the evening, he felt a small warmth settle into his chest. Not heat, exactly. Just the gentle weight of belonging. That night, as he settled into bed, he thought of the village, not as it had been, and not as it was now, but as something between. A place in motion. A story unfinished. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like space waiting to be filled. By footsteps, by laughter, by whispered hopes and cautious dreams. The next morning, he rose early again. The sun was pale but steady, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet grass. He opened the door, stepped into the light, and smiled. There was much still to do, but there was time now. Time to work. Time to mend. Time to live. And he would take it, one quiet day at a time. The church bell hadn't rung in many months, but it still stood tall at the center of the village square, its wooden frame slightly tilted with age and the long rope that once beckoned villagers now stiff with disuse. In better days, the bell had been a constant rhythm in the lives of the people. It had marked the hour of rest, the hour of work, the beginning of feasts, and the slow silence of reflection. It had called people together under one roof and reminded them that they belonged to something larger than their small tasks and daily worries. Now, the bell remained as a silent relic, its presence both a comfort and a reminder of a time that had passed. Toland passed by it most mornings on his way to the stream. He didn't need water from there. His own well was still reliable, but walking to the stream had become part of his new routine. It gave him a reason to move, to breathe in the morning air, and to see the land beyond the village fences. The path to the stream was worn but overgrown in places, and each step seemed to carry the memory of those who had once walked it with baskets in hand and chatter on their lips. Now, the birds were the loudest voices on the trail, and their songs, though bright, felt distant in meaning. As Toland reached the water's edge, he sat on the same flat stone he had favored since childhood. The surface was smooth, shaped by time and footsteps, and offered a wide view of the forest that bordered the land. The stream moved gently, not rushing, not dragging, just flowing steadily, like breath. He picked up a small twig and traced circles in the dirt at his feet, not drawing anything in particular, just letting his hand move while his mind wandered. Across the water, a deer stepped softly between the trees, pausing to sniff the air before disappearing into the brush. In moments like this, the world felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something unnamed to begin again. The village had changed in ways that were visible and invisible. Some homes had been boarded shut, their windows dark and forgotten. Others showed signs of quiet activity, smoke rising from chimneys, herbs drying in windows, shoes left just outside the door. Toland noticed the signs but never intruded. The people who had remained valued their solitude as much as their survival. There was a rhythm to their days now, one of cautious connection. They might not speak often, but they saw one another. They nodded, they paused, they made room for each other on the narrow path to the stream. One afternoon, Toland walked past the old schoolhouse. It was a simple building with a slanted roof and a wide wooden door that used to creak loudly when opened. The windows were fogged with age, and dust lined the sills, but behind the grime, he saw a flicker of movement. Curiosity led him closer, and he gently pushed the door open. Inside, the room was filled with stillness, broken only by the slow drift of motes dancing in the sunlight. Desks stood in crooked rows, tiny chairs tucked neatly beneath them. The blackboard bore faint chalk markings, half-erased letters and numbers, a rhyme that ended mid-line. He ran his fingers along one desk, the surface rough where a child's hand had once carved their name. The room had the feeling of a place left in haste, a place expecting to be returned to in a day or two, not left to gather dust for seasons. A stack of books sat near the front of the room, their pages slightly curled from damp. He picked one up and opened it slowly, revealing drawings of animals and plants, labeled in careful script. It was the kind of book he had studied when he was young, long before he had chosen the trade of leatherworking. He smiled faintly, remembering the teacher's voice, the way she had brought each lesson to life with stories and riddles. Her name had been Mara, and she had worn a ribbon in her hair every day, changing the color with each new week. Mara had not returned when the silence lifted. No one had seen her since the days when the streets emptied and homes closed their doors. Her cottage still stood near the northern field, its windows shuttered, its garden wild and untended. Toland had passed it once and felt the pull of memory, the image of Mara waving from the porch, a book in one hand and a pie in the other. She had once given him a pair of gloves she had sewn herself, insisting that even leatherworkers needed protection from winter's bite. He had kept those gloves for years, until they wore thin and the seams came apart. He never replaced them. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the schoolhouse, not doing anything in particular, just existing in the space. It was a strange kind of comfort, being in a place designed for learning and laughter. It reminded him that before everything had changed, life had been full of moments that didn't seem important at the time, games played on the steps, chalk drawings on the wall, questions asked with wide eyes and eager hands. Those small moments had formed the foundation of the village's soul. Without them, everything felt quieter, but in remembering them, something stirred. That evening, he returned home and pulled out his journal. It was a gift from his uncle many years ago, bound in thick hide and filled with pages only half used. He sat by the hearth and began to write. Not a story, not a message, just thoughts. He wrote about the schoolhouse, about Mira's gloves, about the deer at the stream and the leaf on his windowsill. He wrote because the words made him feel grounded, because shaping sentences gave structure to the blur of days. He had not written in months, but now it felt necessary, like lighting a candle in a dark hallway to remember the shape of the walls. Over the next week, he began visiting other empty places in the village. Not to mourn them, but to remember them. He walked to the weaving house, where looms still stood beneath dust-covered tarps. He stepped into the potter's shed, where shelves held rows of unfired clay bowls, their shapes rough but full of promise. He paused at the grain store, where the bins had long since been emptied, but the smell of oats still clung faintly to the air. Each place held echoes, not loud or obvious, but persistent, like the faint hum of a song once sung. He started drawing maps in his journal. Not maps for directions, but maps of memory. He marked where he had found certain footprints, where he had seen the first snowflake of the season, where Mira had planted her herbs, where the schoolhouse still whispered stories. His maps weren't meant to guide anyone else. They were his own quiet record, proof that these things had existed, that they still mattered, even if only to him. One morning, he returned to the bell tower. The rope was frayed, the wood warped with time, but it still stood strong. For a long while, he just stood there, listening. Then, with a breath drawn from somewhere deep in his chest, he reached for the rope and gave it a gentle pull. The bell groaned, then clanged, a sound too loud, too foreign, startling in its boldness. He let it ring once, then twice. Not enough to summon a crowd, but enough to say, "We are still here." The next day, someone had placed flowers at the base of the tower. Wildflowers, picked from the edge of the forest, tied with a simple strand of twine. Toland didn't know who had left them, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone had heard the bell and answered not with words, but with a gesture. As winter crept closer, the village grew quieter again, but the silence was different now. It was no longer a silence of absence, but of rest. Fires burned in hearths, and the scent of stews and roasted roots drifted through the air. People moved slower, bundled in layers, nodding greetings as they passed. Children, once too frightened to play, began tossing stones in the road again. Laughter returned in fragments, small, uncertain at first, then steadier. Life was rebuilding itself not with grand declarations, but with shared glances, quiet cooperation, and the tender patience of people learning how to live again. Toland added more to his journal, recipes Mira had given him, a poem the teacher had left pinned to the chapel door, a sketch of the deer who visited his garden one snowy morning. His world had become smaller in some ways, but deeper too. Each day brought something new to remember, something worth recording, even if only for himself. He knew that rebuilding didn't mean restoring everything to what it had once been. Some pieces were lost, some paths closed. But what remained was enough. A bell that still rang. A village that still stood. People who, despite everything, had chosen to stay and find meaning in the echoes. And in those echoes, they found not only what had been, but what could still be. The first true frost of the season arrived silently, as though it had crept in during the darkest part of the night, careful not to rouse the sleeping village. When Toland opened his door that morning, he found his front step glazed in a soft shimmer, the grass brittle beneath his feet, and the air filled with that unmistakable scent of early winter, clean, dry, and expectant. He pulled his cloak tighter, the fabric rough from many years of wear but still warm, still dependable. The sun barely lifted above the treetops, casting long, thin beams through the branches and painting the rooftops in streaks of pale gold. The world looked dusted with silver, and though it lacked the color of spring or the fullness of summer, it possessed a strange beauty, quiet, subdued, and enduring. Inside, the hearth crackled with a new fire. Tolan had prepared the kindling the night before, anticipating the shift in the air. He had always been sensitive to changes in the weather, able to feel them in his joints and in the subtle hush that blanketed the landscape just before a season's turn. As he sat near the warmth, his hands wrapped around a wooden cup of broth, he stared into the flames and thought of how different winters used to be. In years past, there had been feasts in the village square, neighbors helping one another with firewood, and songs drifting from the chapel steps as the snow began to fall. But now, the winter prepared to settle over a quieter world, one that moved slower and carried the weight of recent memory. Yet there was strength in that slowness. The village, though reduced in number, was adapting in its own deliberate way. People had begun to weave new habits out of the old, an act of preservation, but also of redefinition. Where once the streets had been filled with celebration and noise, they were now lined with gestures of care. Baskets of dried herbs hung from doorposts. Lanterns, crafted from old jars and filled with tallow, glowed faintly at dusk. Children had taken to gathering pine cones and arranging them in patterns along the path to the well, a quiet game that brought unexpected smiles to those who passed by. Tolan noticed that people had begun exchanging goods again, not with the same brisk bargaining that once filled the market, but with quiet offerings and mutual understanding. Mira, who now baked 3 times a week, left small loaves wrapped in cloth outside the homes of elders who seldom ventured out. In return, someone, perhaps Darren or one of the carpenter's sons, repaired her roof with new timber gathered from the edge of the woods. There were no written agreements, no formal ledgers, only the slow rebuilding of trust and community, one thoughtful act at a time. One afternoon, while walking past the chapel, Tolan saw a young woman standing on a stool, fastening dried branches into a simple wreath above the door. Her name was Ellen, and she had once been an apprentice to the village healer. She nodded at him as she worked, her hands red from the cold but moving with purpose. He paused, not wishing to interrupt, but she spoke without looking down. "I remember you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You used to bring your mother here in the evenings. She liked the way the candles looked in the windows." Tolan's breath caught for a moment, not out of sadness, but from the unexpected warmth of memory. He hadn't thought of those walks in some time. His mother, slow on her feet but sharp in mind, had always insisted on attending evening blessings. She believed in routines, in traditions, in the comfort of repetition. He nodded slowly. "She liked the quiet," he replied. "Said it helped her sleep." Ellen smiled faintly. "It still feels like hers, somehow. This place." They stood in silence for a moment longer, the cold nipping at their ears, their breath curling in the air. Then Ellen adjusted the wreath, stepped down from the stool, and offered a small jar wrapped in cloth. "I've made a tincture," she said, "for winter aches. You might need it." Tolan accepted it without hesitation. It wasn't just the tincture he valued, but the offering itself, a gesture that meant someone had thought of him, that he was remembered, that he was still a thread in the village's weaving tapestry. Back at home, he placed the jar on a shelf above the hearth and sat down to his workbench. His leather supplies had grown low, but he made do with what he had, repurposing scraps, trimming the edges of older items, stitching carefully to conserve every inch. That day, he worked on a new pouch for Mira, something simple and strong, with a reinforced seam and a loop for tying. As he stitched, he found his mind wandering not toward the past, but toward the quiet network that was forming again among the villagers. They no longer gathered in large crowds or hosted elaborate events, but they were connecting nonetheless through shared work, exchanged goods, and quiet visits that filled the spaces between solitude and togetherness. That week, he began attending the evening gatherings that had started forming around the chapel's outer courtyard. Elin, the schoolteacher, had suggested them first, a chance for people to sit together and share stories, news, and warmth. They brought small offerings, a jar of preserved berries, a loaf of sweet bread, a carving, a song. There was no schedule, no roster, only a fire in the center and a welcome seat for any who came. Tolan at first lingered at the edges, but each night he sat a little closer, spoke a little more. The conversations were gentle, meandering, filled with long pauses and soft laughter. No one pressed for answers. No one asked where others had been or why they hadn't come sooner. The very act of being there was enough. Children, who had for so long moved in the shadows of grief and caution, began to speak more freely. They asked questions about the world beyond the forest, about animals they'd never seen, about seasons they barely remembered. Elders told stories, not of recent sorrows, but of older times, when the village had faced harsh winters and found ways to endure. These tales were not meant to diminish what had happened, but to remind everyone that hardship had long been a part of life, and that endurance, too, was woven into their bones. As the frost deepened and the days grew shorter, the village entered a kind of quiet rhythm. Mornings were slow, filled with the smell of porridge and the sound of chopping wood. Afternoons were spent in tasks, mending fences, clearing paths, checking on neighbors. Evenings brought firelight, warm broth, and the distant echo of a song carried on the wind. Tolan found that he no longer felt like a ghost walking through the remnants of a life. He felt present, engaged, useful. His hands were busy again, and his heart, though cautious, beat with steadier hope. One evening, while walking home from the gathering, he passed by the old weaving hall. The door, long sealed, had been pushed open slightly. He stepped inside and found a woman working a loom by candlelight. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her hands moved with practiced ease. She looked up, met his eyes, and smiled. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I used to weave for the market." "I remember," Tolan replied. "You made blankets with the border of blue flowers." Her smile widened. "You have a good memory." He watched her work for a moment, the threads tightening under her careful touch, the shuttle clicking rhythmically. There was something deeply soothing in the motion, in the sound, in the very act of weaving, a practice that turned chaos into order, fragments into fabric. She looked up again. "I've started weaving stories into the cloth," she said. "Tiny patterns. A feather for Mira. A tree for Darren. A boot for that boy who runs everywhere." Tolan chuckled softly. "Will I get one?" "I'm still deciding what you are," she replied. "Maybe a fire. You seem steady." He thanked her and stepped back into the cold night, warmed not by the fire, but by the thought that even now, people were finding ways to make meaning, to honor one another, to mark the passage of time not with loss, but with symbols of connection. Back at his cottage, he sat once again at his journal. He drew a simple pattern, a flame surrounded by thread. And beneath it, he wrote a single phrase, nestled safely in a full paragraph. "Even after everything, we are still being woven together." The village, still healing, still quiet, was not what it had once been. But it was becoming something else, something slower, more deliberate, more human. And Tolan, once unsure of his place in it, was beginning to feel that he belonged not just to its past, but to its future. The days had grown shorter, as they always did this time of year, but the passage of time felt different now. The sun, never eager to rise, barely stretched itself above the hills before beginning its slow descent once more. The evenings came quickly, curling around the village like a wool blanket too heavy to throw off. The frost on the windows thickened each morning, and smoke from chimneys marked every home that had a fire to offer warmth. Tolan had always preferred spring, the season of renewal, of soft rains and green shoots, but this winter held its own lessons. It didn't roar in with sudden fury or burden them with endless snowfall. It settled in gradually, steadily, until everyone realized they had been living inside it for some time. Each morning began in a similar way. Tolan would stoke the embers in his hearth, adding just enough wood to coax the warmth back into life. He would heat a small pot of broth and stir it slowly, listening to the quiet sounds of wind brushing past his shutters. Then he would pull on his boots and cloak and step outside, where the air greeted him with a firm hand, bracing and undeniable. His footprints in the snow joined those of neighbors, some heading toward the well, others to the woods or down the slope to check on livestock. The village no longer bustled, but it moved. The people were quieter, but they moved forward, one task at a time. Winter had always been a test in the countryside. In years past, preparation had been everything. Wood had to be chopped and stacked high. Grain stored properly. tools repaired before the ground hardened. This year, however, preparation had been a patchwork of efforts. Many of the villagers had not had the time or strength to prepare in the old way. Some had only begun gathering firewood in the last days of autumn. Others relied on shared stores and the kindness of neighbors. But they adapted. They adjusted expectations. They rationed with grace. The season wasn't about thriving. It was about learning how to remain, how to endure together. Toland found himself spending more time near the chapel courtyard where the evening gatherings continued, though now they huddled closer to the fire and wore thicker cloaks. A canopy had been strung up between two old beams, offering some protection from the falling snow. Each evening, someone brought something small to contribute. One night it was a kettle of boiled chestnuts. Another evening, it was a jar of spiced honey that Elin passed around with slices of tough bread. These offerings were not feasts, but they warmed the soul as much as the stomach. The villagers sat close, shared warmth, and exchanged stories. Some recounted old village tales, others spoke about their parents or grandparents, how they had made it through hard seasons long ago with fewer tools but stronger hearts. One evening, Toland brought a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a carving he had been working on, a simple piece of wood smoothed and shaped into the form of a fox with its tail curled. He placed it near the fire and said nothing, but the others understood. It was a gift, not to one person, but to all. A symbol of something clever and enduring, something that belonged to the woods and to the stories of their childhood. Mira picked it up carefully and smiled. She placed it on a flat rock near the fire where other small gifts had begun to gather. A small woven bracelet, a string of berries dried and strung like beads, a piece of parchment with a poem written in soft ink. They were creating a new kind of shrine, not for worship, but for remembrance and hope. The days between gatherings were filled with labor, though less urgent than in the past. With fewer mouths to feed and smaller herds to tend, the work was manageable. Toland split logs in the mornings and delivered them to homes with smaller stacks. He repaired tools with spare leather and string, patched gloves, reinforced boots. The repetition of work grounded him. His hands no longer trembled when he reached for his tools, and his shoulders no longer sagged under the weight of memory. There was something sacred in the tasks of winter, each one a quiet promise to keep going, to care, to build again. Occasionally, he would visit the edge of the forest, where the snow lay deeper and the trees stood close together. He gathered kindling there, but more than that, he found peace in the silence. The forest had always been a place of stories and warnings, but now it offered stillness. The kind that didn't press or demand, but simply accepted. He would sit on a stump and watch the way snow fell through branches, the way a bird would hop along the ground looking for hidden seeds. In the forest, time didn't feel like something he had to track. It simply passed, like the breeze through the pine needles. Back in the village, the children began to reclaim parts of their world. Toland watched with quiet amusement as they created games using sticks and stones, building small forts in the snowbanks and pretending to be explorers on great missions. Their laughter was not constant, but it came more freely now. They no longer flinched at shadows or clung to their mother's skirts when a stranger passed. They were remembering how to be young. One boy, in particular, Levi, the son of a weaver, had taken to wearing a red scarf every day and declaring himself captain of the snow patrol. He led other children on quests to find winter treasures, such as pine cones shaped like stars or icicles long enough to serve as wands. Toland once handed him a piece of polished wood shaped like a shield, and Levi received it with a ceremony so serious it nearly brought tears to the eyes of every adult watching. These moments mattered more than anyone admitted aloud. They were signs that healing was not just for the grown, not just for the ones who remembered how things had been, but also for those still shaping their first memories. The village would never be exactly as it was, but perhaps it didn't need to be. Perhaps what mattered most was that it continued, that the laughter returned, that bread still rose, that foxes were carved and scarves were worn and the forest still breathed just beyond the edge of their homes. As the days passed, the snow deepened and the nights grew longer. The villagers lit more candles, not to chase away darkness, but to soften it. Windows glowed with soft yellow light, and the smell of stews and baked apples drifted into the streets. Toland took to writing in his journal every evening, recording not just his own thoughts but what he observed. The way Mira had braided her hair with twine, the new song Elin had taught the children, the way the frost formed perfect patterns on the windows like feathers or tree branches. His journal became not just a record of survival, but a testament to beauty in small things. One night, as he sat by the hearth, he opened a package left at his doorstep. Inside was a piece of cloth, simple, but carefully stitched. On it was the symbol Sarah had spoken of weeks ago, a small fire, surrounded by threads. Beneath it, in tiny embroidery, was his name. He held it in his hands for a long time, heart full and quiet. The village had seen him, truly seen him. Not just as someone who had survived, but as someone who mattered. He hung the cloth above the mantel, where the firelight danced across its threads. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and slow. He watched it through the window, warm cup in hand, and felt a kind of peace settle into his bones. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of continuing. The peace of choosing to stay, day after day, even when the world had changed. This winter had not brought abundance, nor celebration, but it had taught them how to remain. It had shown them that survival was not only about food and shelter, but about connection. About knowing your neighbor's name, about carving foxes and sharing songs, about sitting in the dark and lighting a candle, not because you expected someone to see it, but because it was worth lighting anyway. Toland closed his eyes, listened to the soft crackle of the fire, and smiled. The air began to shift long before the snow had fully melted. It wasn't something anyone could point to directly, no single moment where winter stepped back and spring took its place, but rather a slow unfolding. The sky, still gray most mornings, had begun to brighten earlier. The wind, once sharp and biting, grew softer, brushing across cheeks like a cool whisper instead of a scolding hand. The birds returned first. Not in great flocks, but in pairs and trios, their calls thin but certain as they perched in the bare trees and hopped along fences in search of something buried beneath the last layers of frost. For Toland, the first true sign of change came one morning as he stepped out into the still chilly air and noticed a cluster of green shoots pushing through the soil near the side of his cottage. He knelt down, brushing away a thin crust of snow, and revealed the tender beginnings of what might become wild onions or perhaps early herbs. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that something was growing. Spring had always brought with it a sense of preparation in the village, and even now, with their numbers fewer and their customs quieter, the people responded to the season's arrival with a gentle urgency. Toland found himself rising earlier, not because he was needed somewhere in particular, but because the light had changed. It beckoned him to move, to stretch, to open the shutters and let fresh air touch the corners of the room that had gone still during the long winter. He began sweeping out his workshop more thoroughly, oiling his tools, inspecting the scraps of leather he had stored away in case they might become something useful. It wasn't about profit anymore. No one was bartering with coins or counting trade value. The work was about contributing, about showing up, about creating something with his hands that someone else might find helpful. The village paths, once packed with snow and edged by silence, grew busier, not bustling, but breathing again. Children emerged first, pulling sticks behind them like carts, creating games out of puddles and rocks, chasing each other with playful yelps. Their feet grew muddy, their sleeves wet, but their spirits lifted in a way that felt almost miraculous. Mara opened her bakery windows for the first time since autumn and began experimenting with dried fruits someone had found stored safely in an old shed. The scent drifted through the streets like a message. Something sweet was returning. At the edge of the village, where a few abandoned cottages stood half-collapsed and tangled in ivy, a group of villagers began clearing a space. Toland walked by one afternoon to find Thomas, the carpenter's son, stacking stones with two others, marking off a section of land. Curious, Toland asked what the space would become. "A garden," Thomas said simply. "For everyone." The idea made sense. Food had been shared all winter, and with no single family able to supply much more than their own needs, a shared space for growing vegetables and herbs would ease the burden. But it was more than practical. It was symbolic. The act of planting together was a way of rooting their hopes into the very soil beneath them. Toland offered to help, and by the following morning, he was there with his tools, working alongside others to clear weeds, pull out stones, and turn the earth that had gone hard over the colder months. They worked without much talking, but the energy between them was calm and steady. Some hummed softly. Others paused now and then to drink water or stretch their backs. Each movement, no matter how small, contributed to something larger, a plan for a future that could not be predicted but could still be shaped. They dug neat rows and planted what they had: root vegetables, herbs, a few stubborn seeds saved from past seasons. No one knew if everything would grow. But they planted anyway. Because planting was, in itself, an act of faith. Toland began noticing other changes too. Elin, the schoolteacher, had begun holding lessons again, not in the old schoolhouse just yet, but outside, beneath the canopy of an old oak tree near the chapel. The children gathered there with slates and chalk, their cheeks red from the chill but their eyes bright. Elin taught reading, numbers, stories from long ago. The lessons were short, sometimes just a song or a rhyme, but they were steady. The children returned each day, eager to learn, to gather, to feel the world taking shape again. One day, Elin approached Toland with a request. She needed pouches for the children's slates and chalk, something simple they could carry. Toland smiled and nodded, already imagining the shapes and folds, the ways he could use his remaining leather to make each one sturdy yet soft. He spent the next 2 days at his workbench, crafting them with care, adding small touches to each: an extra loop for hanging, a stitched star in the corner, a pattern pressed into the flap. When he delivered them to Elin, her gratitude was quiet but profound. The children gathered around, choosing their pouches like treasures, examining them with awe. One child, the smallest, clutched hers like it was a gem. Later that week, as he sat near the garden and watched the soil begin to take on color, Toland reflected on how far they had come, not just in surviving, but in continuing. The grief remained. He felt it in the quiet moments, in the empty chair across from him at the evening fires, in the names that went unspoken. But the village had not allowed sorrow to define it. Instead, they had woven it into something deeper, something that supported the roots of a new way of living. The chapel, once reserved for quiet reflection, now held community gatherings once a week, not services, not sermons, but conversations. Villagers shared stories, asked questions, spoke of their hopes and fears. Sarah brought cloth to embroider. Levi told long, winding stories about adventures in the forest that left the children wide-eyed and the adults smiling. One evening, Toland shared a passage from his journal, the first time he had ever read aloud from it. His voice shook at first, but as he continued, the words grew steadier. He spoke of the first signs of spring, of the green shoots near his cottage, of the way light had changed. And when he finished, the room remained silent, not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. Spring deepened, and with it came small celebrations. A few villagers organized a day to clean the stream's path, clearing out branches and stones so the water flowed more freely. Others began crafting wind chimes from shells and bits of wood, hanging them from door frames so that gentle music returned to the breeze. The fields remained sparse, but small gardens bloomed in unexpected places, on windowsills, in clay pots, beside paths. Color returned, not in grand bursts, but in soft, hopeful strokes. One evening, Mira invited several villagers to her bakery for what she called a night of shared warmth. It was the first true gathering in a home since the silence had lifted. Toland arrived to find the small space filled with the smell of baking and the soft glow of candlelight. People sat on benches, leaned against walls, passed around bowls of stew and fresh bread. They talked, they laughed, they listened. It wasn't loud, but it was full. Full of life. Full of presence. That night, as Toland walked home beneath the stars, he looked up at the sky, the same sky that had once felt so vast and indifferent. It still was, in a way. But now, it also felt familiar. Protective even. Like a quiet guardian watching over their fragile but growing world. He paused outside his cottage, listening to the soft rustle of wind in the trees, The creak of his door as he opened it, the subtle crackle of the fire he'd banked before leaving. He stepped inside, wrapped himself in a thick wool blanket, and sat down at his table. He opened his journal and began to write. He wrote about the garden, about Ellen's lessons, about the music in the breeze. He wrote about the children's laughter, and the way Myra's stew had tasted like something from years ago. And as he finished the final line, he closed the book with a soft smile. Spring had returned. It hadn't swept in with fanfare or song, but it had returned nonetheless. And with it, the village had remembered how to grow. The color came back slowly, as if it wasn't quite sure whether it was welcome. It didn't arrive in bursts or banners or fanfare. It showed up in cautious ways, one shade at a time. First in the buds of the trees that lined the road to the stream, their tips tinged with the faintest green. Then in the petals of tiny wildflowers peeking out from between stones and fence posts, their purples and yellows soft as whispers. And eventually in the vegetables beginning to rise from the village's shared garden, blushing radishes, curled lettuce, and the eager stalks of green onions stretching upward with more confidence than the people who had planted them. Toland noticed the change one morning when he opened his shutters and found that the vines climbing his cottage wall had sprouted fresh leaves overnight. He leaned out the window and breathed in deeply, catching a scent that he hadn't smelled in over a year, the sweet, grassy aroma of new growth. As spring ripened, the village began to carry itself differently. The people moved with a cautious sort of energy, still careful, still respectful of the quiet they had grown used to, but no longer wrapped in the heavy coats of winter weariness. Mira started wearing a scarf in her hair again, bright blue this time, tied back in a neat knot. Children played longer in the daylight, lingering until the shadows grew long and their parents called them in with half-hearted reminders about supper. The evenings were warmer now, and the chapel courtyard gatherings grew larger. People brought chairs, blankets, baskets of bread, and sometimes even instruments, flutes, wooden whistles, and a drum someone had unearthed from a storage chest. These weren't loud affairs, nor rowdy, but they were full. And more importantly, they were alive. Toland had never been much of a musician, but he found joy in listening. He would sit near the outer ring of the group, carving small figures from the wood he collected during his walks. Foxes, birds, rabbits, even a miniature version of the chapel bell tower. The children often gathered around him, quietly watching as his blade turned rough bark into smooth shapes. He gave the figures away freely, not because he didn't value them, but because he believed that small beauty deserved to be shared. One child, a girl named Rinna, began collecting them and tying them onto a string she wore around her waist. She called them her pocket friends, and insisted that they helped her sleep better at night. Toland didn't argue. If a carved rabbit brought peace, then who was he to question it? The garden became a central point of the village again. What began as a shared necessity had grown into something far more meaningful. People came not just to work the soil, but to see each other, to talk while pulling weeds, to laugh over crooked carrots and celebrate when the first ripe tomato appeared on the vine. They organized their planting with quiet coordination, never needing much discussion. A rhythm had returned, not the same rhythm as before, but a new one, shaped by experience, softened by memory, and strengthened by shared survival. One day, Ellen, the healer's apprentice, approached Toland with an idea. She wanted to plant herbs not just for cooking, but for healing. Lavender for rest, mint for soothing, comfort for poultices. She asked if he would help build raised beds along the side of the chapel where the sunlight lingered longest. He agreed immediately, and together they spent 2 afternoons hauling timber, filling the frames with rich earth, and planting the first seeds with careful hands. They spoke little during the work, but there was a sense of shared understanding between them. Ellen had lost her mentor the previous year, and had taken on her role with quiet determination. Toland had noticed how she moved through the village, checking on the elders, offering advice when someone coughed, mixing teas with steady hands. She was young, but she carried herself like someone who had seen more than her years would suggest. The herb garden became her sanctuary, and Toland continued to stop by each week to check the frames and mend the wooden supports when needed. The plants grew quickly in the spring warmth, their scents drifting through the air like gentle reminders that care could still be cultivated, even in a place once marked by fear. Toland began adding herbs to the pouches he made, tucking sprigs of lavender or sage into the seams so that their scent would rise whenever the pouch was opened. Mira said it made her think of her mother's kitchen. Darren claimed it kept his joints from aching. Whatever the truth, it made people smile, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, a new idea began to take shape, one not sparked by necessity, but by creativity. Elin, the schoolteacher, wanted to organize a festival. Not a large one, and not meant to resemble the grand harvest gatherings of the past, but something simple and small to celebrate the changing season. She spoke of music, of shared food, of games for the children. Some villagers hesitated at first. They weren't sure they were ready. The wounds from the past still rested near the surface. But slowly, as Elin described her vision, a garland of flowers across the chapel gate, hand pies made by Mira, music played beneath the oak, heads began to nod. Toland offered to help with the decorations. He worked with Thomas and Sarah to string together garlands of fabric and flowers, weaving strips of old cloth with herbs and blooms into something colorful and fragrant. They decorated the fences, the chapel gate, the market stalls. The children helped, of course, tying ribbons on fence posts and arranging small painted stones around the garden beds. When the day of the festival arrived, it wasn't grand, but it was beautiful. The sky was clear, the breeze soft, the scent of fresh bread and sweet berries drifting on the air. Villagers gathered slowly, hesitantly, like deer stepping into a clearing, but as the sun climbed higher, the mood lifted. Laughter returned. Children ran with wildflowers in their hair. Darren played a tune on a wooden whistle that made everyone clap in time. Toland sat near the herb garden, watching it all with quiet gratitude. He hadn't known what to expect from the day, but seeing his neighbors gathered, not just alive, but joyful, filled him with a warmth that settled deep into his bones. Elin stood beside him at one point, handing him a slice of Myra's hand pie. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The sounds around them said enough. That night, as the festival wound down and the candles flickered low, Toland returned to his cottage with tired feet and a full heart. He sat at his table, opened his journal, and wrote for a long time. He described the festival, the games, the garlands, the taste of sweet berries, the tune of Darren's whistle. He wrote about the children's laughter and the look in Myra's eyes as she watched her brother dance with a joy that hadn't touched him in months. He wrote about the garden and the way Ellen knelt beside it with her hands in the dirt, her face peaceful. And when he finished, he closed the journal gently and placed it on the shelf beside the carving of the fox he had made that winter. In the days that followed, life continued its quiet rhythm. The festival had been a moment, a bright thread woven into the broader fabric of recovery. But its effects lingered. People smiled more readily. Children sang songs they had learned during the games. Mira added extra spices to her bread. Toland received new requests for leatherwork, satchels for foraging, straps for tools, even a soft band for a dog's neck. He took on each task with quiet joy, grateful for the purpose and the connection. Spring, in its full bloom, had reminded them of something essential, that life, while fragile, could also be resilient. That beauty, while fleeting, could return. And that a village, even after hardship, could remember how to grow together again. The summer sun arrived in quiet degrees. It didn't burst forth in a sudden blaze of heat but crept up over the days like a shy guest, first warming the soil gently, then drawing out the scents of wild herbs and ripening vegetables from the village garden. The air grew thicker, but not uncomfortably so. It buzzed with the soft drone of bees and the distant fluttering of laundry hung on lines between cottages. Toland noticed that the light now poured into his cottage differently, warmer, more golden, casting shadows across the floor in soft, waving patterns as the vines outside rustled in the wind. He had always loved this time of year, but now, after so much loss and stillness, he found a new appreciation for the way the seasons continued, steady and indifferent, offering beauty no matter what the people beneath the sky had endured. Each morning, Toland began his day by walking the garden path that had formed between his door and the central planting space. The others called it his thinking walk, though he didn't do much thinking while on it. Instead, he observed. He noticed how the leaves turned toward the sun, how small insects made homes beneath stones, how Ellen's herbs had spread beyond their borders and now mingled with the low grasses near the chapel. He saw that Mira had begun planting marigolds in pots near the bakery windows, not for food, but simply for color. He saw the children making daisy chains and laying them like crowns on the heads of dogs and sheep alike. And he saw, most importantly, that the village was healing, not in a loud or sudden way, but gradually, like skin closing over a wound, leaving a scar that did not scream but simply existed. In the afternoons, the village came alive in its own quiet way. The fields, which had once stood neglected and overrun, now bore the careful furrows of returning farmers. The sound of hoe against soil replaced the silence that had lingered too long. The hammering of nails, the turning of wheels, the clinking of tools against stone all returned, not in chaos, but in harmony. People didn't speak much of what had come before, but they didn't avoid it either. The loss was part of the rhythm now, like a bass note under every song, present but not overpowering. It made everything else feel more real, more earned. One warm afternoon, Elin asked Toland to visit the schoolhouse. The children had resumed lessons indoors now that the air was warm and the roof had been repaired. As he stepped inside, the familiar smell of wood, ink, and parchment greeted him like an old friend. The children sat cross-legged on woven mats, chalkboards in their laps, and eyes wide with curiosity. Elin stood at the front, her sleeves rolled up and her hair braided down her back, speaking gently as she pointed to symbols drawn on the board. When she saw Toland enter, she smiled and motioned him forward. "I've told them about the days before," she said softly, "but they want to hear from someone who remembers." Toland was hesitant at first. He wasn't used to speaking to groups, especially not children. But Elin handed him a small stool, and the children shuffled closer with eager faces, and he found himself sitting down and clearing his throat. He didn't plan a speech. Instead, he began by describing the bakery as it had been 2 years ago, the smell of sweet loaves in the morning, the long lines of people trading stories while waiting for their turn, the little bell that Myra's father had tied above the door. The children listened intently, some of them not old enough to remember it at all, others perhaps just starting to recall fragments. He told them about the spring fair, the way the square had once filled with fabric stalls, roasted nuts, songs, and dancing feet. He described the laughter, the games, the old man who used to juggle apples by the fountain. Then, he shifted gently, speaking not about what had been lost, but about what had changed. He talked about how the bakery still stood, how Mira now ran it with pride. He mentioned the garden and how everyone contributed to its growth. He described the new herbs by the chapel and the figures he carved that now traveled from one child's pocket to another. And most of all, he spoke of kindness, of the way people now paused to help each other, of how a loaf of bread might show up on a doorstep without a word, of how stories, shared in the evening light, had become more precious than gold. When he finished, the children clapped gently, and one boy raised his hand. "Do you think it will ever be like it was before?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. Toland thought for a moment. "No," he said honestly, but with a smile. "But I think it might be better in ways we never expected." Afterward, Elin thanked him with a pot of tea and a slice of bread spread with berry preserves. They sat in the shade outside the schoolhouse, sipping slowly, letting the quiet surround them. Elin spoke of how much the children had changed since the winter, how their drawings had become brighter, how they asked more questions, how they played more freely. She said it as though she were still surprised, still unsure whether it was safe to believe in the return of joy. "I think they carry everything with them," she said. "The hard times, the quiet ones, the good days. It's all part of them now." Toland nodded. "It is for all of us." In the weeks that followed, he began writing down more than just his own thoughts in his journal. He started collecting stories. He asked the villagers to tell him their memories, their favorite festivals, the songs their parents used to sing, the names of their first animals, the best meals they'd ever eaten. He wrote it all down, not to preserve the past exactly, but to honor it. To make sure that the richness of what they had lived through, both the joy and the sorrow, didn't vanish when the older voices eventually grew quiet. He called it the village book. He stitched the pages together himself, bound it in sturdy leather, and set it on a table in the chapel for anyone to read or add to. At first, few approached it. But slowly, one by one, entries began to appear. Mira wrote about her first loaf that didn't rise and how her father had eaten it anyway, declaring it the best brick he'd ever tasted. Darren added a memory of a storm that once tore off half his roof and how the whole village had shown up with nails and hammers the next morning. Elin contributed a lullaby her grandmother used to sing about a fox who wore a hat. Even the children began to write small, clumsy sentences about their favorite hiding spots, their dreams, their hopes for the next festival. Reading through the entries, Toland often found himself smiling, sometimes laughing, occasionally pausing, hand resting on the page, heart heavy but not sad. The stories weren't all happy, but they were true, and in their truth, they offered comfort. Proof that life, even when cracked and stitched together, still held beauty worth sharing. The village, once defined by what it had endured, was now becoming something more. It was becoming a place of memory, yes, but also of presence, of growth, of promise. People planted with more confidence. Children ran farther from home before being called back. The air was filled not just with the scent of bread and herbs, but with the sound of music, real music, played on flutes and hummed as people worked. And through it all, Toland continued his quiet rituals. His morning walk, his carving, his journal. He continued to visit the garden, to share meals, to stitch pouches and repair tools. He still paused at the stream on warm afternoons, listening to the birds and watching the water curl over stones. And each time he opened his door, he stepped out not just into the village he had known, but into the one they were all building together, piece by piece, story by story. The road that led out of the village had once been a busy thread woven through the land, linking their quiet world to markets, neighboring towns, traveling performers, and seasonal festivals. It had once carried carts of fresh fruit, weary travelers, cloth merchants, and curious children who ran alongside horses and watched the horizon with wide eyes. In those earlier days, the road had represented possibility. It was the way out, the way in, the way forward. But after the stillness settled across the land and people had turned inward to survive, the road had grown quiet. Grass crept over its edges. Weeds poked up between stones. Wagons no longer rattled over it, and unfamiliar faces no longer approached from the far hills. It became a path less walked, a memory more than a route, until it was only used by the occasional wanderer brave enough to look beyond the safety of the garden walls and the warmth of the chapel hearth. Toland had not walked the full length of the road in over a year. He had passed the first bend often, usually to gather herbs or check on a broken fence post where a neighbor's goats had once escaped. But he hadn't followed the entire path, hadn't traced its slow arc toward the far ridge, the tall oak, the overgrown mile markers that once told travelers how far they had to go. Until now. Something had shifted within him. It wasn't restlessness, exactly, not a desire to leave, but a need to look, to see what had become of the world beyond the place that had sheltered him so carefully for so long. He prepared early, just after sunrise, packing a satchel with bread, dried apples, and a small flask of water. He added a carving knife, a scrap of parchment, and a bit of charcoal wrapped in cloth. Before stepping out, he glanced around his cottage. The hearth was banked. The windows were open to the warm air. The fox carving still sat on the mantel. Nothing felt out of place, but something inside him told him he would return with a different set of eyes. The road welcomed him in its own way. The stones beneath his boots were familiar, though worn smooth from years of weather and memory. The trees cast long shadows across the path, and birds flitted through branches, singing songs that hadn't been heard in many seasons. Toland walked slowly, not with hesitation but with reverence. Every step was part of a story he hadn't finished reading. He passed the first fence line where wildflowers had begun to reclaim the land. He nodded to the stump of a tree that had once shaded the summer market, now ringed with mushrooms. The air smelled of earth and pine and something else, something open and promising. Further down the road, he came across the old traveler's rest, a stone bench carved long ago and set beside a wide oak tree. Moss now covered the edges, and a vine had made a home across its legs. He brushed it off gently and sat for a moment, stretching his legs and letting the sun warm his shoulders. From here, he could see the rolling hills that marked the edge of their territory. In the distance, smoke rose from a chimney, not from their village, but another, unseen for many months. He stared at the smoke, imagining who might be there. Were they planting as well? Singing by firelight? Did they speak of the same lost seasons, the same quiet recoveries? After resting, he continued. As he walked, he passed familiar landmarks. The crooked fence where children once dared each other to climb, the stream where traveling dogs had once lapped, the tall post that had once held the fair's banner. All of it remained, though touched by time and softened by stillness. At a bend in the road, he paused to sketch a view, just the outline of the hills and the scattering of wild trees. It was a simple drawing, but one that marked the moment. A way of saying, "I saw this. I was here. The world is still wide." Eventually, the road reached a small rise where a tree with twisted branches stood like a watchful guardian. From here, he could look back and see the rooftops of his village, small, clustered, calm. Smoke curled from the chimneys. The sun caught on a weather vane that still turned slowly in the wind. It was a beautiful sight, more so than he remembered. Distance had given it shape. He thought of all the lives moving quietly within those homes. Mira kneading bread, Elin teaching children near the chapel, Ellen tending her herbs. It filled him with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for all of them. For what they had endured and chosen to rebuild. He did not go farther. There was no need. The road continued, and perhaps one day he would follow it beyond the ridge. But for now, it was enough to know that the road still existed, that the world was still there, not lost or forgotten, just waiting. He sat beneath the twisted tree and pulled out a bit of bread, chewing slowly, listening to the wind. He thought of how many travelers had rested here, how many stories had begun on this very path. And he wondered what future tales would be told by those who found their way back. When he returned to the village, the sun was beginning to fall behind the hills. The sky glowed with streaks of pink and orange. As he passed the garden, he saw a group of children drawing in the dirt with sticks, creating winding shapes and names in their playful script. One of them looked up and waved. Tolan raised a hand in return, his heart full. Back at his cottage, he lit a candle, opened his journal, and wrote. He described the road, the stone bench, the tree with the twisted branches. He wrote about the view of the village, the feeling of standing outside and seeing it whole. He wrote about the smoke in the distance, and the way the sky had opened up. And then, with careful strokes, he sketched the road itself, not as it had once been, nor as it might be, but as it was now, open, quiet, alive. In the days that followed, Tolan shared his walk with others. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply mentioned the trees, the view, the sound of the wind. Others began to follow. First Aaron, then Elin, then a group of young people who had never walked that far before. They came back with their own observations. Flowers they'd found, stones shaped like hearts, a fox that darted across the path and disappeared into the woods. They too began to write and sketch and tell. The road had become not just a memory, but a place of connection. And so, it remained, not as a way out, not as an escape, but as a path that reminded them all of what was still possible. The sun, which had so cautiously returned in spring, now ruled the days with warmth and steady light. Its golden reach stretched across fields, rooftops, and gardens, casting long shadows in the morning and coating the land in amber hues by evening. In this soft summer glow, the village stood like a painting that had slowly added back its colors, bit by bit, layer by layer, until now it resembled something whole, though different than before. Life had returned, not all at once, but in gentle waves. And now, as midsummer approached, the people began to look forward to something that hadn't been spoken of in earnest for some time. the first full harvest. It wasn't as large as it had once been, of course. The fields were smaller, the hands fewer, and many of the crops planted were hardy and simple. But the garden behind the chapel was thriving. The vegetables were green and strong, and the herbs had grown wild and fragrant, some spilling out of their wooden beds like excited children leaning over fences. The early root vegetables were nearly ready to pull. The squashes had begun to bloom. Beans curled around trellises that Thomas had built using fallen branches and lengths of twine. And the villagers, once unsure if anything would grow again, now walked the garden rows with hope in their eyes and baskets in their arms. Toland was among those who had taken on the quiet responsibility of preparing for the harvest. He wasn't a farmer by trade. His hands knew leather and carving better than soil, but he understood care. He understood how to watch for signs of readiness, how to listen to the plants as they told their stories in the shape of their leaves and the firmness of their stems. He worked alongside Mira and Ellen, pulling weeds, adding compost, guiding young sprouts gently back into place when wind or animals had disturbed them. He had even constructed a small shelter near the edge of the garden using leftover planks and canvas, a place to rest in the shade and to gather tools between tasks. Each morning began the same way now. Toland would rise early, before the heat took hold of the day, and walk through the village with a steady step, nodding to others already up and about, Darren carrying buckets of water from the stream, Elin sweeping the steps of the schoolhouse, children trotting past with chores barely remembered. The garden was never empty. Someone was always there, kneeling, watering, whispering quietly to the leaves. It had become the heart of the village, not just for food, but for comfort, for connection, for purpose. In the center of the garden stood a tree, tall and spreading, its branches casting shade over a bench that Mira had built from old crates. This spot had become a meeting place, where villagers would pause to talk or rest. Sometimes, Toland would sit there with his journal, sketching the changing shapes of the plants, noting which rows needed thinning, which blooms had turned to fruit. Other times, he would simply watch the way the wind moved through the leaves, the way sunlight dappled the ground in shifting patterns. The children, ever curious, had taken to helping in their own way. Rinna, still proudly wearing her collection of wooden carvings around her belt, had begun naming the plants. Each tomato plant had a name and a story. The carrots were a family. The beans, she claimed, were building a castle along the trellis. Her imagination delighted the adults, who began using the names too, laughing gently when someone referred to a cucumber vine as Lady Tall Hair, or warned others to step carefully near King Root Nose. These playful names gave personality to the work and reminded everyone that joy could live even in the most ordinary of tasks. As the days passed and the vegetables neared readiness, the villagers began preparing for a small celebration, not as grand as festivals of old, but a gathering nonetheless. Elin suggested they call it the First Table, a simple name for a simple act, coming together to share the first fruits of their labor. It would be held in the garden itself, with benches borrowed from the chapel and tablecloths sewn from scraps of linen dyed with herbs and berries. Each family would contribute what they could: a basket of greens, a pot of stew, a loaf of bread, a jar of jam. Toland was asked to prepare something with his hands, not food, but an offering of craftsmanship. After some thought, he decided to make a centerpiece for the table, a carved wooden bowl filled with figures representing the season's blessings. He shaped a loaf of bread, a bunch of herbs, a single candle, and a bird in flight. Each piece was small, delicate, and polished until the grain of the wood glowed in the light. He arranged them carefully in the bowl and wrapped it in a cloth tied with twine. It wasn't flashy, but it was meaningful, and when he placed it on the center table the morning of the gathering, many paused to admire it before taking their seats. The first table began quietly, as most things in the village now did. People arrived in pairs and small groups, placing their contributions gently on the long table and finding seats among neighbors. The sun was high, but the tree's shade was wide, and a breeze kept the air from growing too heavy. Children sat cross-legged on blankets, nibbling on slices of melon and whispering excitedly about the games that would follow. Mira passed around baskets of warm rolls, and Ellen poured cool drinks infused with mint and lemon balm. Laughter returned, soft and hesitant at first, then steadier, rising like the chime of bells. Elin stood briefly and offered a few words, not a speech, but a blessing. She thanked the soil, the rain, the hands that had worked, the hearts that had hoped. Her voice was not loud, but every word carried weight. When she sat down, no applause followed, just a deep silence, filled with emotion, then the soft clink of cutlery, and the beginning of the meal. As they ate, Toland looked around the table and took in the sight. Sarah passing a dish to a boy who had once cried through every winter night, now smiling with berry-stained cheeks. Darren explaining how to tell when a squash was truly ripe. Elin braiding flowers into her hair while two children watched and tried to copy her movements. It was a feast, not of abundance, but of meaning. Every dish had been grown, prepared, and shared with care. Every word spoken carried the echo of a world they had rebuilt with patience and tenderness. After the meal, the children performed a short play they had written together, a humorous tale about a group of vegetables who went on an adventure to rescue a kidnapped turnip. The costumes were made of burlap and ribbons, and the dialogue was often interrupted by giggles and forgotten lines. But no one minded. The adults laughed and cheered, clapping loudly when the carrot knight triumphed with a spoon instead of a sword. The joy was genuine, the applause full of affection. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned pink, Toland remained in the garden long after most had gone. He sat on the bench beneath the tree, his fingers resting lightly on the carved bowl, now half filled with flower petals and seeds left behind by playful hands. The candle carving had been taken by one of the children, he noticed, and he smiled at the thought. Let it be a keepsake. A reminder that light had returned. He opened his journal and began to write, not just about the meal, but about the feeling. The way sunlight touched the table, the way Myra's bread smelled like her father's bakery, the way laughter had found its voice again. He wrote about how harvest didn't just mean food, but the gathering of stories, of strength, of people. He wrote that survival had been the first goal, but that now, living fully had become the new pursuit. And as he closed the book and tucked it away, he realized that the harvest was not the end of something. It was a beginning. A beginning of seasons that might follow without fear. A beginning of traditions reborn not in imitation of the past, but in honor of it. A beginning of trust that the world, while uncertain, still held beauty and belonging for those who dared to plant again. It had been a long time since anyone from outside the village had walked the main road and come through the low gate with dust on their boots and stories on their tongues. In the past, such visits were common. Traders, musicians, pilgrims, and neighbors from the next valley over would appear without much ceremony, greeted with warm bread and open arms. But after the stillness, the long season of withdrawal and caution, the road had remained mostly quiet. The villagers had not closed their gates entirely, but neither had they looked outward with the same eagerness. Their energy had gone into mending what lay within their borders, homes, relationships, soil, and spirit. They had become protectors of what was left, caretakers of a fragile peace, and builders of a new way of living. So when the first visitors returned, they were met not with suspicion, but with silence, a pause to remember how it felt to open the door again. It began one mild afternoon, when the sun hung high and the scent of basil and fresh-cut grass drifted lazily through the village. Toland was in his workshop, fitting a buckle to a new pouch for Ellen, when a shadow passed his window. It wasn't a child or one of the regular paths taken by his neighbors. He paused, set down his tools, and stepped outside. From his doorway, he saw a small group approaching, 3 people, strangers by the looks of them, walking slowly but purposefully up the main path. One was older, with a walking staff and a wide-brimmed hat. Another, a woman with a large pack and a scarf over her hair. The third, a younger man, leading a small cart piled with tools and bundles of cloth. They looked weary, but not desperate, travelers who had come a long way but still had strength in their stride. The villagers noticed them too. Windows creaked open. Doors remained ajar just long enough for quiet glances to be exchanged. No one ran out to greet them. No one shut themselves away. It was a moment of balancing. The space between memory and hope, between caution and welcome. Mira emerged from the bakery first, wiping her hands on her apron, and approached the strangers with a calm smile. Tolan followed, and soon others gathered, forming a small circle around the travelers. The older man introduced himself first. His name was Jory, and he explained that they had come from a village several valleys over, one that had also gone quiet during the time of stillness but was now rebuilding, much like their own. They had heard whispers, stories passed from trader to trader, that a village had survived, tended a garden, and begun again. They hadn't been sure it was true, but they had decided to see for themselves. They brought no requests for shelter, only news, and perhaps a few things to trade if anyone had need. The villagers listened, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cautious wonder. News from beyond their own borders was rare, and hearing that other places had also endured brought a strange sort of comfort. Jory spoke of small gatherings returning in the towns beyond the ridge, of inns that had reopened, of a woman who had begun making paints again, selling them in little glass jars, of songs sung by campfire, and a field where children played with hoops and sticks while their parents planted barley. The stories were not grand, but they were real. Elin stepped forward and offered them water, and Mira insisted on sending for bread. The travelers were invited to rest in the shade of the old oak tree near the garden, and as the afternoon unfolded, the initial tension softened. Questions were asked. Names were exchanged. The younger man, named Bran, showed the children how to tie a new kind of knot with twine. The woman, called Sela, offered to share a recipe for preserving herbs that lasted through the winter. Jory and Darren began comparing stories of their respective towns' repair efforts, laughing over how long it took to fix a roof when your best carpenter had never worked sober. By evening, it was clear that the visitors would stay the night. A space was cleared in the schoolhouse, where traveling guests had once been welcomed in earlier days. The blankets were aired out. Extra food was prepared. And as the sun dipped behind the trees, a new kind of gathering took place, not one of just the familiar, but one that included voices from outside, accents that curled words differently, and eyes that had seen other landscapes under the same sky. Tolan, for his part, found himself both comforted and stirred. He had grown used to the boundaries of the village, to the rhythm and safety of a world made small by necessity. But hearing the travelers speak of other places that were not lost, just distant, reminded him that the world was still wide. That stories were still being told far beyond their fields. That the road he had walked weeks ago was not a closed loop, but a thread that could be followed in either direction. That night, after the meal had ended and the laughter had faded into tired goodbyes, Tolan sat by the window in his cottage and looked out at the path beyond the garden. Fireflies danced above the grass, blinking softly like stars that had drifted down for a closer look. He thought of the road again, of the bench beneath the oak, of the rising ridge where he had first seen smoke in the distance. He didn't feel the need to leave, but he no longer feared the space beyond the horizon. It was no longer empty. It was full of people like them, quiet survivors building new ways to live. The next morning, the travelers prepared to leave, but not before offering small gifts, a packet of seeds from their village's own garden, a hand-drawn map showing nearby settlements that had begun to reopen, a carved medallion shaped like a sun, made by a boy who had survived by carving in the dark. In return, Tolan gave Bran a fresh strap for his pack, Elin handed Sela a book of children's riddles written by her students, and Mira packed them a cloth bundle of fresh bread and honey. Before they left, Jory turned to the group gathered by the garden and spoke simply. "You have made something beautiful here. May it grow." As they walked down the road, disappearing slowly into the soft morning light, the villagers stood in quiet reflection. Not because they were sad, and not because they feared what came next, but because something important had happened. A door had opened. A story had returned. The world, once small and uncertain, had begun to stretch again, not in overwhelming ways, but in manageable, meaningful ones. In the weeks that followed, more visitors came. Not many, and never unannounced, but just enough to remind the village that they were part of something larger. A traveling singer with a voice like falling rain. A woman who traded thread dyed with beetroot and marigold. a pair of brothers who offered to repair a section of the old bridge in exchange for shelter and stew. Each brought something, an item, a song, a memory, and each took something with them, a story of a garden that grew from stillness, of children who gave names to vegetables, of a man who carved foxes and birds to help people remember. Tolan recorded each visit in his journal. Not just names and gifts, but how they made people feel. The first time someone danced again. The first time someone asked what it might be like to travel themselves. The first time someone drew a map of the nearby region and pinned it to the schoolhouse wall. The village remained grounded in its rituals, gardening, gathering, teaching, but now it had threads reaching outward. Threads of curiosity, of courage, of possibility. And in the center of it all stood the same quiet truths: that community could be rebuilt, that beauty could be born from quiet soil, and that the road, once feared, had become a bridge. Not to escape, but to connect. By the time the final leaves turned gold and the first chill of autumn crept through the village, the people had already begun preparing in ways both practical and symbolic. Unlike the past year, when uncertainty had blanketed their days like a thick fog, this year brought with it a sense of readiness, a steady breath, a measured step. The fields had given what they could. The garden near the chapel overflowed with herbs and roots, many of which had been dried or stored in jars. The orchard, modest but loyal, had dropped its final apples, and Myra's bakery shelves now filled the air with the scent of spiced bread and warm cider. Each home held more than it had before. There were full baskets, knitted scarves, preserved fruits, and even laughter tucked into the corners. But beyond the physical signs of preparation, something deeper had taken root, a quiet confidence that this winter, though still uncertain, would not find them empty or afraid. The villagers worked without panic. They gathered firewood, not in frantic stacks but in thoughtful bundles, tying each with twine and storing them neatly beside hearths and sheds. Tolan, whose hands had shaped pouches and straps all summer, turned his craft toward cold weather needs. He repaired worn boots with extra lining, fitted cloaks with stronger clasps, and stitched mittens for children using scraps of felted wool. He even carved new wooden toggles for Myra's coat, adding tiny decorative stars into each one, not for function but for comfort. His workshop now smelled of beeswax, pine resin, and the earthy scent of leather warmed by the sun. It was no longer just a place for mending things. It had become a place for small acts of care. The village gatherings continued, but with a slower pace. As the daylight shortened, so did the hours spent outside. Fires were lit earlier. Candles flickered in windows. The garden no longer required constant attention, but the people still visited it, sometimes to dig up the last stubborn parsnip or to check the frost line creeping along the raised beds. More often, they came simply to sit, to remember the months they had spent planting, weeding, and harvesting together. The garden had grown more than food. It had grown trust. And now, as the year curved toward its end, it stood as a quiet monument to resilience. Elin proposed that they mark the turning of the year, not with a celebration as bold as the harvest, but with something reflective. A time to honor what had been, to acknowledge what had changed, and to set intentions for the seasons ahead. She called it the Circle Night. It would take place on the final evening before the frost fully settled, when the last leaves clung to branches and the stars began appearing before supper. The idea spread gently through the village, gathering momentum without urgency. People began preparing not with decorations or music, but with stories. Each family was asked to bring something small to share, a memory, a lesson, a wish. Some began writing in journals. Others carved small tokens or embroidered scraps of fabric with symbols meaningful to them. Tolan chose to carve a set of 5 wooden figures, a seed, a flame, a hand, a leaf, and a circle. He placed them in a small pouch and tied it with leather cord. Each shape held its own meaning: beginnings, warmth, connection, growth, and unity. He would explain them if asked, but he didn't expect anyone to do more than touch them and perhaps feel a little more steady. On the night of the gathering, the village met by the garden, where Thomas had built a simple wooden circle around the old oak. Lanterns hung from the branches, swaying gently in the breeze. Blankets were spread across the ground, and a fire crackled in the center, its flames bright but not roaring. The people arrived slowly, some with baskets, others with nothing more than their presence. The children, wrapped in cloaks and knit caps, clutched their gifts and whispered excitedly. Mara brought a loaf shaped like a braid, dusted with cinnamon and sugar. Ellen carried a small bowl of pressed herbs and oils, each one labeled with a word like peace, patience, or kindness. Sarah had woven a tapestry of scraps collected throughout the year, old apron strings, curtain edges, even a bit of ribbon from a wedding that never happened. It was a tapestry not of perfection, but of pieces, joined together to make something unexpectedly whole. Elin began the evening by thanking them all, not as a group but as individuals. She named each person, looked them in the eye, and said something they had done that had helped the village: planting, teaching, cooking, tending, listening. Her voice was soft, but the silence that followed each name carried weight. No one felt left out. No one was overlooked. It was not a night for spectacle, but for truth. Then the circle began. One by one, people stepped forward to share what they had brought. Some told stories, memories of loved ones, of seasons past, of mistakes made and grace found. Others handed their tokens into the fire gently, letting them burn not in sorrow, but as a way to release and renew. A few spoke barely above a whisper, but the flames carried their words nonetheless. Children sang a short song they had written about the garden, and Mira wept softly behind her scarf. Tolan waited until near the end. When he stepped forward, he offered the pouch of carvings to the group and simply said, "These are the pieces I carried through the year. If they mean something to you, take one." By the end of the night, the pouch was empty. The next morning, frost had formed in delicate patterns across windows and garden beds. The village stirred more slowly than usual, not from fatigue, but from reflection. Circle night had not been a feast or a spectacle. It had been something deeper, a gathering of threads woven into one long, quiet cloth. People returned to their homes with lighter hearts and heavier blankets, their larders full, their spirits steady. Tolan stood at his doorway and looked at the now empty garden, its soil resting, its vines brittle and bowed. He didn't see emptiness. He saw rest. He saw preparation. He saw the pause before another beginning. That winter life continued with calm purpose. The villagers shared what they had, visited often, and returned to the old practice of making and mending. There were more books being read, more letters written, more music hummed beside the fire. When visitors passed through, less frequently now, but always welcome, they remarked not on how large the village had become, but how whole it seemed. They noted the laughter in the children's voices, the way neighbors spoke with warmth, the quiet pride in the garden gate even when covered in snow. Tolan began work on a new journal, this one not just for himself, but for the entire village. He invited others to write entries, to draw pictures, to press flowers between pages, to add their voices to the record. It became a living book, one that grew not only with time but with intention. Each story was a thread, each page a stitch. And when the snow finally melted, when the garden was turned once again and the first green shoots poked through the dark soil, the people didn't rush. They moved with care. They planted with gratitude. They remembered the frost. They remembered the fire. And they looked toward the future not with fear, but with readiness. The seasons had turned. And so had they. When the second spring arrived, it did not announce itself with fanfare, but with the same gentle confidence that had grown inside the village over the past year. It was familiar now, not just the season, but the cycle itself, the cold lifting, the earth softening, and the people leaning forward into the warmth. The smell of damp soil, the songs of birds returning to rebuild their nests, and the sight of early shoots pressing through garden beds all reminded the villagers that the world continued to move whether they were ready or not. But this time, they were ready. This time, they welcomed the season with open windows, clean doorsteps, and hands already accustomed to the rhythm of planting, tending, and sharing. It wasn't just that they had survived a difficult year. It was that they had taken what remained and made something steady, something beautiful, something worth growing again. Tolan rose early on the first warm morning of the new spring. The sun had not yet fully crested the hills, but light spilled softly through the trees, painting long golden stripes across the ground. The cottage was quiet, the air still cool, but the warmth of the hearth's fading embers reminded him that the coldest days were behind them. He moved with practiced ease, stretching, pulling on his boots, and stepping outside into the kind of air that makes every breath feel new. Across the garden path, he could already see signs of movement. Thomas checking the trellises he had built the previous summer, Rinna skipping down the lane with a basket in one hand and a story ready in the other, and Mira standing in front of her bakery, hands on her hips, assessing her herb pots with the keen eye of someone who already knew what she would plant and where. The village had changed. Not in its layout, not in its structures, those remained mostly the same, but in its rhythm, its heartbeat. It had become quieter in the way that contentment is quiet. No longer tense or uncertain, the village now moved at a thoughtful pace. People smiled more easily. Laughter came without being coaxed. There were still moments of sadness, old memories resurfacing in the turning of a season, in the echo of a song once sung by someone no longer present. But even those moments were woven gently into the new life they had all agreed to nurture. It was not about forgetting. It was about remembering in a way that allowed joy to take root again. The garden, once just a hopeful experiment behind the chapel, had expanded. New beds had been dug, new rows marked with sticks and string, and a small greenhouse made from salvaged glass and timber now stood near the herb plot. Ellen had taken the lead in organizing the planting efforts, her knowledge of healing plants growing stronger with every passing month. She now kept a small journal of her own, filled with sketches, observations, and pressed leaves, which she used to teach the older children how to recognize plants by their shape, scent, and growth habits. Tolan often watched these lessons from a distance, amused by the way the children jostled each other to answer questions or show off a newly discovered sprout. It was a far cry from the silence of the previous spring, when the children had spoken in whispers and followed their parents like shadows. New structures had appeared, too, not just practical ones, but thoughtful ones. A bench had been added near the stream, carved with the names of those who had helped rebuild the path. A small roofed platform had been built at the edge of the village where travelers could rest without entering, and where villagers could greet them or leave offerings of food and water. The schoolhouse had a new sign, painted by one of the younger villagers, depicting a book resting on a leaf, its pages open to the breeze. These small additions, created with care, made the village feel not just repaired, but renewed. One afternoon, as the warmth of the sun grew bolder and the scent of fresh grass filled the air, Tolan sat in the chapel courtyard sketching in his journal. He had taken to drawing more often, not only plants and objects, but people. He had begun to capture the way Ellen's hair curled when she laughed, the way Darren leaned on his walking stick when telling stories, and the way Myra's hands moved like poetry when she kneaded dough. These sketches filled pages between written notes and observations, forming a record of village life that was both personal and shared. Anyone who wanted to see them was welcome. Some had even asked him to teach them to draw, and so, twice a week, a small group gathered by the chapel steps to learn how to shape shadows into smiles and lines into likenesses. The idea of art, of expression, had taken hold in the village with surprising strength. After months of working only to survive, the people had discovered the importance of creating for the sake of beauty and connection. Stories were shared more openly now, and not just around the fire. Songs were being written, dances choreographed by children who claimed the garden paths as their stage, and poems copied neatly onto scraps of paper and pinned to the chapel's walls. One corner of the garden had even been set aside for what Mira jokingly called the gallery, a space where anyone could place a carving, a woven ornament, a painted stone, or any object that brought joy. It wasn't about talent. It was about truth. About sharing pieces of the self and inviting others to see them. Tolan's carvings had become sought after, not because they were rare, but because they carried meaning. He continued to make small animal figures, but now he also shaped symbolic items, a pair of clasped hands, a candle in a bowl, a tree with roots and branches twisted together. One morning, he found a figure he had made months earlier, a small bird in flight, resting on the windowsill of a neighbor's cottage. The paint had faded, but it was still upright, still watching the sky. He smiled and walked on, feeling the quiet joy of knowing that something he had made still brought comfort. It was Elin who proposed that they mark the new year not just by surviving another season, but by naming it. She called a meeting beneath the old oak tree, and the villagers came with ideas. They tossed out words like renewal, return, strength, and song. Rinna, now bolder than ever, suggested they simply call it the year we remembered how to live. The group paused, then laughed softly, and agreed. It fit. It was more than a title. It was a truth they had all lived through, each in their own way. So they wrote it, on the chapel wall, on the schoolhouse door, on parchment nailed near the garden gate. The year we remembered how to live. It didn't need to be explained. Everyone already knew what it meant. That spring passed with fewer surprises and more shared celebrations. The planting days became events of joy, with music, food, and the occasional dance. The children competed to see who could harvest the first ripe berry, and Mira began offering ribbons as prizes, always mismatched, always cheerful. Toland continued his work, but now with an ease he hadn't felt in years. His hands moved without urgency, without the weight of fear. He crafted, he taught, he walked the paths of the village with eyes open not just to what was needed, but to what was beautiful. By the time summer arrived, the garden was full again. The paths were clear. The trees bore fruit. And the villagers no longer marked their days by what had been lost, but by what had been made, together, with care, with patience, and with love. The village had not returned to what it once was. It had grown into something new. It had become a place not only where people lived, but where they thrived. Where they sang, created, mourned, celebrated, taught, played, built, and remembered. Where the rhythm of the seasons was matched by the rhythm of hearts that had learned to beat more softly, more kindly, more deeply. And through it all, the road remained open, not only the one leading out, but the one leading in. Because now, after everything, the people of the village knew how to welcome what came. They knew how to plant, how to gather, how to rest, and most importantly, how to begin again. And so, as the seasons turned once more and the soil warmed beneath bare feet, the village remembered not only how to survive, but how to truly live. Their homes were still small, their gardens still modest, their songs still soft, but their hearts were full. In every shared loaf, every carved figure, every whispered story by firelight, there was something more than memory. There was presence. There was peace. You've now walked alongside them, through silence and soil, through winter and warmth, and you've seen how even the quietest places can grow again when tended with care. Perhaps there's something in their story that echoes inside your own. A rhythm you've been missing. A season you're stepping into. A stillness that, when honored, becomes strength. As you close your eyes tonight, let that rhythm settle deep within you. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts drift like candlelight flickering in the chapel window. Let your breath move like a soft breeze over the garden beds. You are safe here. The hardest season has passed. You are part of something steady, something whole. And when you wake, the world will still be turning gently, ready for your footsteps, your voice, your quiet kindness. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.